Hey guys, welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about all the non-leather working supplies that I keep in my shop that aren't really intended to be used necessarily only for leather work, but I found that I like to keep these supplies in the shop where I always have some because there's different little situations where they come in real handy. So we're going to hop in and I'm going to kind of just go through and I'm going to kind of show you why I keep some of these, what I use them for, and you might want to start keeping those in your shop as well. Okay, I'm just going to kind of move through these things. As you can see, most of the stuff in this pile, I just went around the shop and just gathered all the things that I get at like the hardware store. I thought about doing this video today because I was driving back. I ran to Shiner to get some stuff from our little hardware store down there. When I'm there, there's just certain items that I always have in mind, and I usually just grab another package there just so that I have plenty, because it's not something that I use all the time, but when you're in a pinch or a bind or you got a little problem, sometimes these items will come in really handy to just have them in your shop. And that way when you need them, you've got them. But it's not going to be necessarily something that you use every day, so you're probably not going to remember. So just start you a little list, and hopefully this video will help you. One of the first things that I like to keep, and I forgot to get today, I forgot to get a few things today. I was kind of in a hurry. But anyway, we got to go back tomorrow anyway because I got to get some other stuff. But one of the first things is acetone. I do keep acetone in my shop to thin my glue. That's mainly what I use it for. So whether you're using barges or I think Masters or just the weldwood contact cement that I get from the hardware store, then that I thin with this acetone. And it works really good. So if you have it in your tub and it gets a little thick, you can always put a little bit of this in there, stir it up, and it'll break it down, and it'll thin it out some. That's one of kind of my deals I don't like about barges cement. One is the price. Two is that it's too thick usually. And so I used to thin it down with this. I know Barges sells its own thinner. I usually try to stay away from things that have their own side product that helps to thin it down or something like that. Just because if I run out of acetone or I run out of my glue, then I will run to the store. I can run down the hardware store and get some. Speaking of which, I forgot to bring the glue up here. Let me grab a can and I'll show you exactly which glue I'm using. We've talked about it in other videos, but I'll pair it with this. Okay, so this is the glue that I use in my shop. I use this on saddles, I use it on my belts. This is my primary contact cement, and it's made by Weldwood or DAP company, and it's just a standard contact cement. It's not necessarily made for leather, but it'll stick anything you put this on. And basically, this is really good glue. It is thinner than your barges and stuff like that, which is one reason I like it. But the main reason I like it is, even if it was more expensive than barges, I would probably still buy it because I can run down there and get it. If I'm in a real bind on a Sunday and I'm out of glue and I've got to get something done, I can run down to Victoria, which is an hour, and I can find a Home Depot that's open on Sunday, and I can pick up this contact cement. So I'm not limited to just staying ahead of myself and being sure to order enough and that kind of deal. And like I said, I thin it down with the acetone. Real quick note on this can though, if you buy these big cans of the contact cement, they do come in the smaller cans. I think it's a pint. If you buy the big can, don't pull the lid off of the paint. What I do is I take a flathead screwdriver or a chisel, and I'll bust a pour hole out in there where it'll pour out of there, and then I just bust another little vent hole right there. That allows me to, when I need to pour up glue, I just pull these two off and I can pour glue into my glue can, and I'm not making a mess everywhere, because when you get this whole lid off of here, it's not going to pour out of this thing very slowly. That tends to work better for me. So that's a little tip there, is not take the lid off, just bust a couple holes in there, and then you could usually do it with a church key, but that's too big for that. But anyway, the acetone, that's what I use it for. I'll also occasionally, very occasionally, I can use acetone to break the finish on a leather project, like mainly a saddle when we're doing a cleaning or a restoration project. If there's a lacquer finish on there, which the saddles from the, say, 60s to the 80s had a lot of lacquer that they used, the finish was a lacquer base. Some of that stuff you've got to actually deglaze it or get it off of there. This is very hard on leather, so if you're going to do that, be very careful. I would not advise, unless you have experience, kind of deglazing a saddle or stripping it of its lacquer finish. You can kind of overdo it and you can begin to burn the leather a little bit, so I just use real caution if you're going to do that. But mainly I use it just for thinning that. I also keep, I don't have much in here, and I very rarely use it, but I also keep some mineral spirits, because you can use them on your antique. If you have a jar of antique that has gotten kind of dry and it's just kind of clumpy in there, you can pour a little bit of mineral spirits in there and begin mixing that up, and it'll begin to break that down and rejuvenate that antique. So if you've got a little can of antique that you really used to like but you hadn't used it in a long time and it's kind of dry, just put you a little bit of mineral spirits in there and begin to mix it up. Just keep adding a little bit, mixing it, a little bit, and mixing it until it gets to the consistency that you want. It works great. So, and I just keep that, I use it for my painting stuff as well. So mineral spirits are just handy to keep around. Keep kind of going down the line here. I also keep some alcohol, just rubbing alcohol. I keep this in here. Mainly we used to keep it for first aid. So in our shop, especially back then, now not so much anymore, but the saddle shop's still dirty. But back then we were doing a lot of repair work. And a lot of these saddles, you don't know what's on these things. And if you cut yourself or, you know, kind of do something and you're repairing a saddle and you slip with your tack puller or something and hit another tack and cut your finger or something like that, I'd always make them guys put a little alcohol on there or hydrogen peroxide, something like that to keep that wound clean, because you don't know what's on these saddles. So you don't want to get an infection from a little nick. But that's mainly what we kept it in there for. But I've also found that some of the Fiberglass dyes you can mix your, like say, get a dark brown. I don't know if it works for the pro dye, but I know some of the spirit dyes, they may be alcohol based. You guys on YouTube are really good about knowing more about the actual ins and outs of the product. I just use stuff. So if you know, maybe comment below so other people will know. But there's one of these you can get. You can just buy a dark brown, mix it with alcohol, and begin mixing it a little bit at a time, and it'll begin to lighten up the dark brown. I read an article years ago, and a fella had said that he didn't buy any color but dark brown, because if he was going to do a light brown belt, he just cut it with alcohol till it got the color he wanted, and then he would put it on the belt and get the light brown. That way he wasn't buying 3 different shades of brown. But alcohol's handy. It's also real handy if you want to clean your tooling stone, or if you have a granite stone on your bench for skiving and it starts to get kind of grimy, or you put something repair on there that you got some grease on there from it or something like that, you can wipe it down with alcohol and that'll clean that granite. And that way when you go in with a new piece of leather to skive it or something, you don't get little marks on there. You can do it with acetone, but like I said, that stuff is kind of dangerous as far as like it's a chemical. And so I try not to use it too much if we don't have good ventilation in your shop. The next thing that I keep is baby powder. Baby powder is just really handy for a lot of different things. One of the things that we would do for folks if they wanted it, most people do it themselves now, but when you build a brand new saddle, some of these guys don't like how they squeak. And the squeak is coming from the leather just making noise as it's trying to break in and seat itself. Sometimes you'll get a little more squeak than others. It just kind of depends on the saddle. But you can take baby powder and blow it up underneath the seat and all along where the riggings are and stuff like that, inside the saddle between the skirts and the housing, or the skirts and the seat. And that'll just mask that noise until all the leather breaks in. But I also use it because I'll use it in a bag, and I'll show you all this on a video at some point. But you can actually put it in a little piece of bed sheet. That's a good material that works good, or a cotton t-shirt. Just take a little square of it and pour a bunch of baby powder down there and then bring it up. And let me get one. Turns out I wasn't real prepared for this video. Anyway, but this is what I'm talking about. It's just a little piece of rag, just a thin rag. I think this was actually a piece of old bed sheet we used to drape over saddles when we weren't working on them, just to keep the light off of them. But you can take a little square of that. It's got baby powder in there, and then when you tap it on something, it dusts the baby powder out. So it actually comes through the fabric. Bootmakers use that a lot for their boot top stitching patterns. So they'll take their paper, whatever their pattern's made out of, they'll fold it in half, draw their pattern on there, and then pull the thread out of their machine and stitch that pattern. It's basically just perforated and making all the holes. Then when they open that up, they can set that on their boot top leather and then dust with this all the way around there and just rub this around, and that baby powder will go through those holes only. And so when you pick that up, you'll have little white dots everywhere where you need a stitch, and that's the stitch lines that they'll follow. I do the same thing when we're stitching a padded seat pattern. So when we're stitching a pattern in a seat for a saddle, I'll make my pattern however I'm going to make it, sew it. I do the same thing the bootmakers do, and then I'll use this to transfer that pattern. Baby powder is great if you are in a boot shop. This is always great. Most bootmakers know this, but drop a little bit of this down in your boot and your boot will slip on a little easier. I've also used it when you're, certain times when you're working on a project, there may be some glue somewhere on the back side of it. You're sewing something in there. I can't think of a particular time, but there's sometimes whenever, if you've got glue on the back side that's been dry and it's dried maybe in a repair situation or something like that, and you're going to go sew on the machine, if that's real tacky on the back side, it'll stick to the bottom plate of that machine and it won't feed correctly. So your stitch length will be off. You can dust it with some baby powder. That'll kill that tackiness of that old glue or that dried glue on the back of the project, and you'll be able to sew it And then if you need to re-glue it, you can just glue right over the baby powder, and it won't affect the glue at all. Baby powder is just kind of handy. The other thing that I like to keep is fiberglass resin. You might not have any need for this at all unless you're messing with saddles, but occasionally we'll have to replace the wood that's on top of a horn, especially on team roping saddles. They burn them off, they burn the leather off, they keep roping out of it, and then they end up pulling the cap completely off. And a lot of times, depending on who made the tree and what type of saddle it is, it takes the wood plug that's on top of the horn off with it. So then when it comes in here, I've got to put a piece of wood on there to be able to replace the horn wrap and cap and all that stuff. It's handy just to have a little bit of fiberglass mat or cloth. This is actually cloth, and then some just a fiberglass resin here. And inside here, it's, if you buy this at like a hardware store, it comes with a little thing of hardener. Got your resin. It's like any other kind of epoxy kind of situation. Real easy to work with. But I've also found other situations in the shop where like, hey, I can fiberglass that or repair that tree, or something's cracked right there or something like that. We don't do tree repair, but occasionally we'll try to get by and get people back on the road. Along the lines of that, I keep some Bondo. That's, again, a tree situation usually. I have replaced a couple actual horns on saddles, not just the leather on them, but actually the horn. And the Bondo comes in handy to get that area where the horn is bolted to the saddle or to the swell, to get that all even and everything. But there's other applications where Bondo can kind of come in handy in a shop, and it doesn't hurt anything to sit on your shelf. And if you use it once every 5 years, at least you have it when you do need it. The other thing that I like to keep is epoxy. This is a 1 minute, no, this is a 5 minute epoxy. They have a bunch of different types. 5 minute is fine. I'm never in that much of a hurry. This isn't an emergency room. 5 minutes, if I can't wait that long, then it probably doesn't need to be done. I go ahead and buy these on Amazon. I buy them in a box. If you don't like Amazon, go pick them up at the hardware store. This epoxy here, it comes with the tips. I like these because if you buy it, you can buy it a lot cheaper if you just buy the big bottles and mix it yourself. And I used to just get a piece of scrap leather, trim me off a little piece I could mix it with, and then apply it where I need to apply it. But in a hurry, this comes in handy, and these tips come in really handy for just different situations where you need to get epoxy down into a certain spot. Again, mainly on saddle stuff. When you're doing a repair, you never know what kind of stuff you're going to run into. Having that tip has saved me a couple times where we've needed something to just stay put when we put it in there. The tree's kind of having issues, and it's just kind of old and everything's watered out. So sometimes epoxy can be very helpful. This is just one of those things that I'd keep on your shelf. You know, buy you 2 or 3 of them, hang them up, always have them, and that way you've got them. The other thing is, while we're talking about gluing stuff, is I'm gonna go on this end over here, just kind of organize this, but is the super glue. This last time I got a deal of this Gorilla Glue. I'm gonna give it a shot. I just like regular old super glue. I'll buy it whatever kind, I don't care. Sometimes, again, you just need something to stick. You need it to stick well for whatever reason. Some of these things I can't think of certain situations, but I've always kept it in my shop and I have used it. And like I said, it's not something you're gonna use all the time. But some kind of super glue, epoxy. I even keep some hot glue. I keep a little hot glue gun and hot glue sticks just for temporary mock-up stuff. Or like my laser for my saddle stand. And we're gonna do another video where we'll talk about non-leatherworking tools that I keep in my shop. So we'll do that video here pretty quick too. And I'll show you that. But on my laser, it's just a laser level. And I actually hot glued a Rumen magnet to the back of that. And so it sticks to my overhead piece that comes on my drawdown stand so that I can shoot that grid across the saddle. Hot glue is great because it'll hold something very well, but then if you need to take it off or you want to do something different, you can just peel it off. Again, I don't use it all the time, but we do use it a fair amount just in certain situations. Again, this isn't going out in final product. This is stuff when you're mocking something up. Maybe you're building a bench, maybe you're trying to get something figured out or do something like that. It's just handy to have hot glue around. That's just something that you need to have in any shop, not just a leather shop. Then as far as keeping, the biggest thing with a lot of saddle stuff is keeping screws tight, like Chicago screws on headstalls. If you're using conchos where you use the little adapters, it's keeping those attached without them jiggling loose or coming loose. Chicago screws are really bad about coming loose on their own. So I hardly won't use them on a belt. If I do use Chicago screws, I won't put any Loctite in there. Headstalls, I prefer to never use Chicago screws on headstalls, but sometimes they want a pretty concho or something like that. I won't do it when I put it together because they've got to still put their bit on usually, but I will tell them and I will show them, get some Loctite, put Loctite in there before you screw that concho together after you put your bit on, because it will come loose. Conchos with screws are just always going to come loose. But if you use a good, I don't remember where I got this thing. I got this years ago, probably 10 years ago, and I still got quite a bit left. And then I recently grabbed one of these while I was at the hardware store. Saw it, grabbed one. Like I said, you're talking $3 or $4 items usually. You buy one, you pick one up, you don't have to know if you're out or not. Just grab one, throw it in the bin. That way you know you have it. So keep some of that around. Then we get to like some sanding stuff. I've had a few questions recently about this, but this brick that I use on my buffing wheel, my cloth wheel, it is just polishing compound, and this is the black. And I get all this from Weaver. You can get it at your local hardware store, but they're gonna be a smaller little cylinder, like a stick, like a big fat crayon is what it's gonna be like. I've never found these big bricks at like Lowe's or Ace Hardware or anything like that, but you can find the smaller sticks, and if you don't use them that often, that's all you need. But they come in red, and they have a green, and then the black. I think the black is the coarsest one. That's the main one we use. I have a piece of this red that's all I've got left, but I've had this box for probably 10 years or so, and I hardly ever use it because I don't like to mix the grits on my buffing wheels, because you need to kind of stick with one color per cloth wheel, and for what we use it for, the black works just fine. But you just load this in your wheel while it's spinning. You just kind of load this in there. That'll put the compound into the fabric or the cloth of the wheel, and then you can buff your conchos like in our clean oil and polish videos. You can buff your tools. If you drop a tool and it hits the floor just right and you get a little nick in it, you can take some of the sandpaper we're about to talk about. You can smooth that off, buff it off on that wheel, and that'll get you back to that mirror finish. And if you dabble with modifying your tools or making kind of your own tools, specialty little tools for doing certain things, like figure carving and stuff, buffing wheel, polish a compound, it comes in very handy. I also use it for sharpening my knife, my trim knife. After the podcast talking to Bruce Johnson, I've since stopped using it for my head knife after hearing some of the horror stories of a head knife going flying around the room. I don't advise using a grinder to buff your head knives. I would use a big strop board or something with this compound on there. And this is the same stuff that I put on my strop board. So that stuff works great. Like I said, I get it at Weaver, but you can find it at Lowe's or Home Depot, Ace Hardware, anything like that. You just got to hunt for it. It'll usually be in the tool section by the cloth buffing wheels. Then we get like some sandpaper, just various kinds. Buy one every time you go. Just pick up a pack so that you always have all kinds of different grits and stuff. This is actually Emery Cloth. The Emery Cloth is really nice because it's actually like a fabric on the back. It will not tear through. If you're using a paper, sometimes it starts to tear, your tool slips through it, stuff like that. This stuff's a lot more sturdy, but it's a little harder to find at hardware stores. I can't always find it. I usually just, if I see some, I'll buy a pack of it. This was just a multi-pack with different grits on there. And then these are wet and dry sandpaper. These are 1500 grit, and then this one is 600 grit. And I got these to start practicing kind of using these to really fine-tune my blades. I'm still learning that, so I'm not going to give you any tips on that just yet. After that interview with Bruce Johnson, it kind of got me curious, so I bought some of this to give it a shot. And it does work. I really like it, so I just keep some of that around. And then I just bought this big pack at Lowe's one day, I don't know, a couple years ago, but it's just got all kinds of different size sandpapers in here. So sandpaper is just something you need in the shop. Sometimes you just need to sand a spot on a tree, or maybe you're doing something else, so you need to just kind of scratch something up or sand it up or whatever. You've got some. Just kind of keep some of that in your shop. Lighters. I keep cigarette lighters in my shop. I do not smoke, but I do keep cigarette lighters in the shop because you always need to burn thread down. So if you're burning, if you're stitching or whatever, if you pull both your threads to the back side, you can cut them a little bit short and then burn that down. Or you can tie a knot and burn it down, whatever you want to do. As long as you're using nylon thread, it's handy for that. I also use it if you're lighters, if you're skiving certain leathers and that skived edge is going to like overlap, so it's going to be on the front and you're not rolling that for some reason, you can, after you skive it down to a feathered edge, you can take that lighter and just real gently singe that real thin edge right there, and it almost like edges it. It kind of curls it, but it'll also burn off any little fuzzies that you couldn't get with your razor blade or with your skive knife. So that works really good. I learned that from a bootmaker, and that works really well just to kind of burn that area out. Like if you're doing a filigree spot with some chap leather and you cut out a certain shape, then you skive the inside of that. You take that lighter and just burn right around in there real fast. Don't sit in one spot very long because it'll burn that edge off, kind of mess it up. But if you move real quickly, you'll just singe any kind of little stragglers that you left, and it'll also make that edge look really nice and clean. So lighters, I just buy a pack of them, keep them in the shop. I also keep tongue depressors or popsicle sticks. These are real fat ones. I keep these in here too. These are just great for getting antique out of jars or whatever you're doing. You can smear antique on if you want. I prefer to use a wool pad to get my antique on my projects, but they're just handy for doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, if you need to get glue in a certain little spot up somewhere, you can get some glue off your glue can, and then you can just put it right where you need it, stuff like that. So they're just handy to have around, as well as rubber bands. So keep a little pile of rubber bands. There's always times when that comes in handy for everything. Then as far as my tapes, we know I keep blue painter's tape. Use that in almost every single video that we do. I don't really care about the brand. Just get you some blue painter's tape. Don't spend a ton of money. All you're doing with it is just putting it on the back. I did have one brand, and I don't remember what it was, but I think it was just really old, but it wouldn't hardly stick to itself, so that stuff wasn't any good. But this one here is 3M. I just buy whatever blue painter's tape they have, the widest one they have, and we're good to go. Then, of course, many of y'all probably already know about this, the double-sided tape that Aaron at Maker's Leather Supply sells. This is also made by 3M. There's probably other places to get it, but he does have it. He does carry it all the time in a, I think this is 1/4 inch, and this one might be 3/4 of an inch. Keep a couple sizes, keep it around. If you watch my videos, you'll see me use this for zippers. It's much, much, much nicer using this than trying to get glue on that fabric zipper tape. I would just beg you to convert to using double-sided tape on your zippers, because the glue is just really, really a pain in the tail, and this stuff works really well. I also use this for my wallets when we're putting our wallet interiors together. Works phenomenally well, makes it quick, and so I keep that around in the shop. I also keep a few syringes. No particular reason. Just there's been maybe 3 times in my career where I've needed a syringe to either get glue somewhere, like in a finished piece. I used it one time on a padded seat on a repair saddle because the saddle had been so oiled and it was old, and the padded seat that the guy wanted me to put in, it just didn't stick to that old leather. After the saddle was done, it ended up popping up in the middle of the seat, and so I had to get some more glue into the dish right there at the pocket. And the only way to get to it is either take the seat out or try to finagle a way to get some glue in there. So I actually used a syringe. I think I used a way bigger syringe and a piece of hose, just real small surgical hose is actually what it was. And I was able to cut some of the pop stitching that I was right there on the side, feed that hose to the hollow spot where the glue wasn't stuck, and then I was able to push some glue in there and then mush that around through the top of the seat, you know, up inside there, and put some weights on there. And it actually worked. I don't know how long it stayed that way, but I'm sure with the guy riding it every day and stuff like that, it probably ended up settling in and staying. But like I said, that situation, my only option there was to pull the seat out, take the padded seat completely out, and re-glue it, which there's still no guarantee that's going to stick. So having a few syringes in the shop kind of saved me on that one, and there's probably another few situations where these may come in handy. So just get you a few syringes, ask your vet, you know, get them at TSC, whatever, just get you some, put them in the shop so you have them. Another thing that I like to keep is just some regular drywall screws. I do use these on my housings when I mount them. That's the only place these screws are used, is just to hold the housing in place. And the reason I use these is because they'll sink down nice and flat, and there's no chance of any, I don't want a washer and a waste of stainless steel screw and all that kind of stuff to hold the housings where they live on the saddle. So that's the only place I use them. But on repair saddles, these come in super handy, because if you're dealing with just an old junky production repair saddle and things just don't want to go back together, or things are loose, or you need to tighten something up, a lot of times you can sink a little 1-inch drywall screw in a certain spot here or there, and that'll really tighten everything up, keep everything from kind of getting loose and flopping off there. So they're just handy to have around. Occasionally need them. I also use them for hanging stuff on the wall sometimes or whatever. This one is something else that I got from a bootmaker, which is just some Crayola magic markers, any kind of magic marker. It doesn't have to be this brand, but it's not a perfect fix. But occasionally, if you deal with a lot of colored leathers, like bright colors, and they're a chrome tan type leather, sometimes during the build of that thing, especially on like a boot, you may end up with a nick somewhere where you've just nicked the grain just enough that you can see the leather underneath the grain, or it's a white spot because you've actually torn just a hair piece of grain off or something. So instead of this project being blue or red or whatever it is that you're making, you've got this one blemish that is, you know, dropped it on the bench, drug it across the bench, whatever, it got hit on the finisher just right. Something happened that just nicked, just a small little nick. Sometimes you can take one of these markers that's the right color, the red or whatever, pick the color, and if you're real careful, you can put that on there, and sometimes that will match it enough to where you won't notice it. If you've got a big scratch across there, or a big break in the finish, or it cracks or something, you're not gonna be able to fix that with these. But if you've got a real small little thing, sometimes touching it with a little bit of that will get it through where it's fine. Then once they get broke in and used, they're gonna get their own nicks and stuff like that on their own anyway. That'll at least cover that one little spot up, because nothing makes you more sick than getting to the very end of a project and you're wiping finish off or polishing it or whatever you're doing, and you're about to ship it out and you see one little spot. I mean, and it's just like, now that you've seen it, that's all you see when you look at that project. The customer probably honestly wouldn't notice it if you left it like that, depending on how big it is. But if it's, I mean, tiny thing, but I can't ever get it out of my mind, and it makes me sick. So these sometimes will help a lot. Like I said, it's only really gonna work on your chrome tan leathers, like a calf or a calf skin, maybe a piece of kangaroo or something that's got a finished grain on it that's a certain color, and sometimes they'll work on that. So you might try it on a piece of scrap before you try it on the actual project, but that is something that I did get from my brother. Actually taught me that as far as the boot making. It kind of helped him with his tops. Every once in a while I'd get a little spot there that he missed or cracked it or something, and you can fix it up with that. The last thing that I keep in here is a torch, a little propane torch. These are really handy for a lot of different things. The first thing and obvious thing is if you know how to solder. So you keep you some silver solder or hard solder, whatever you got. Keep that in your shop. Keep one of these little torches, especially if you're doing saddle work, because you will bust a concho off the wood screw. So at some point, you're going to be tightening them down, taking them off something. The concho and the solder that holds that screw on the back is going to pop off. Freddie was really good at soldering, and he was able to always fix a concho. He'd break them or whatever, getting them off or getting them on. They're just cheap conchos, and he was able to solder them back together, and going down the road, we didn't have to order another concho or try to find one that matched or anything like that. Problem is, I don't know how to solder. I've tried, and I've tried a bunch, and I can't get it to work. Probably just going to have to, at some point, take a little time and have somebody show me how to solder properly. But I don't know how to solder. But I'll give it a shot still. Every time I need to, I will kind of throw it together and see if I can do it. I usually just end up ruining the concho and buying another concho. Another thing they're really handy for is if you do any kind of nylon work, like if you're, say you tie rope halters and you put the leather noseband on the rope halters or something, and you tie your own leads. If you're buying that rope in spools and then cutting your own length so you can tie your halter or make your lead ropes or whatever, you can use one of these and just an old trim knife. This is just one of my old sharp point trim knives that I use cutting out projects and all that. We just use one of these, light this up, hold it right there until it gets hot. Once the blade gets hot, then you can just lay it right down through that nylon rope that you're using, whatever you're kind of using, yacht rope or whatever. You can run it right through there and it'll cut that, burn both sides. You don't have to worry about fraying instead of trying to cut it with scissors or something like that and then burn it separately. Just heat you up some kind of blade or make you something where you can heat it up with this. So that works really good for that. But anyway, they're real handy, so I keep one of those around. There's various other situations where you need just a little bit of heat for some reason or whatever. You can do that. You can just use one of these little, and these things are cheap, these little propane tanks, and they're fairly safe. Just keep them up high if you got kids in your shop so they don't play with it. My boy is always wanting to play with it every time I fire it up, and told him not to play with fire. It went to bed. We don't let him play with that. The last thing that I like to keep in, this isn't the last thing, I'm probably missing a bunch of things, and if I find a bunch more, we'll do another video on just random non-leathercraft items that I keep in my shop. But the other thing is tracing paper. Everybody's seen me use this on different videos that we've done. But this comes in really handy for more than just tooling. If you're designing saddles or designing a project or maybe making a big bag or a big purse and you come up with a cool radius or a cool shape for something, but it's going to be, you know, you need it the same on both sides, so you're trying to make it symmetrical. Just do one side and then you can either carve a line that you're going to end up cutting off or you can draw it on there and then take that and trace it off, flip it over, put it on the other side. When it comes to design work, tracing paper is really handy. I go through a lot of that stuff just because it saves you so much time, and it makes the pattern more accurate as well, because you can put your lineup marks on there, trace off that corner of the binder, whatever you're doing, and you can trace it off and you can flip it, and then you can make everything really symmetrical and really nice. And tracing paper is cheap. It's a lot cheaper than the tracing film or the Mylar. But if you are using the tracing film, don't waste that stuff on like I said, on trying to just, if you're designing and you're trying to get the radius the same on your pattern and you're just tracing that and then you're just going to use it there and then you're done, then just use tracing paper, because it's a lot cheaper than that tracing film. That stuff can get expensive, and so kind of save that for your archival patterns that you're creating that you want to save and maybe reuse at another point. You're going to keep in a nice file, because this stuff, once you use it once or twice, it starts to get pretty ragged and just needs to be thrown out. But that's about it. That's our big collection of things that we keep in the shop that are just kind of random things that you can get at any hardware store. You can get most of this stuff at Walmart or a version of it. You can get it at, Lowe's, Home Depot, any of that. You can probably order a lot of this on Amazon if you're okay with that. These are just the items that I thought, probably ought to mention those, because I've talked to a few people on the phone every once in a while, and I'll ask them about, oh, I don't keep any epoxy, but that's a good idea, because I'll give them a kind of, they're having some trouble or whatever. I give them a little advice on how to get past that problem. And they'll say, oh, I got to go get some epoxy. And so I thought it was neat just to kind of put all these together, show you some of the random little things that we keep in our shop. And we'll try to do another video here pretty soon, maybe next week or something, where we talk about some of the random tools, because I have a lot of random tools that I use that aren't necessarily LeatherCraft tools. They're more mainstream tools that we've just kind of adapted, or they work perfectly for what we're doing straight out of the box. So we'll kind of do that. But I appreciate you guys watching this little tip video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next video.